"You're embarrassing us," my son said, his voice sharp and loud enough for every relative at the table to hear. I didn't answer. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look up right away. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the words settle over me like a cold cloth. The room went quiet in that particular way family rooms do, where no one rushes in to save you, but everyone hears everything. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. It helps me know I'm not alone in this story." The dinner table was set the way I had always set it. White plates. Real silverware, not the disposable kind. The serving bowls I'd owned for decades, washed and dried by hand. I'd arrived early to help, the way I always did, bringing a casserole still warm from my oven. I wore a simple navy cardigan, the one I reach for when I want to look neat without trying too hard. It was supposed to be a family gathering. Nothing fancy. Just relatives in town, a reason to sit together, to eat, to talk. I had been looking forward to it more than I cared to admit. When my son spoke, I noticed the way he didn't lower his voice. He didn't pull me aside. He didn't wait until the room thinned out. He said it right there, in front of his cousins, his aunt, his wife, as if it were a correction that needed to be made publicly. My daughter-in-law didn't say a word. She kept her eyes on her plate, cutting her food carefully, as if this had nothing to do with her. One of the relatives cleared their throat. Someone else took a sip of water. No one met my eyes. I finally looked up and saw my son's face. Not angry, not cruel, just irritated. The way someone looks when they feel inconvenienced. I nodded once. That was all. The food suddenly tasted bland. I pushed it around my plate, listening to the conversation restart in small, careful pieces. Someone asked about traffic. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. The room filled again, but I felt separate from it, like I was watching through glass. As I sat there, I realized something quietly unsettling. No one was confused about what he'd said. No one asked him to rephrase it. No one told him it was unnecessary. That told me more than the words themselves. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a correction. A reminder of where I stood. I thought about how many times I'd hosted dinners like this in my own home. How many holidays I'd planned down to the last detail. How often I'd worried whether everyone was comfortable, whether there was enough food, whether anyone felt left out. I remembered my son as a boy, sitting at my kitchen table, swinging his legs because they didn't reach the floor yet. That boy had grown into a man who felt comfortable telling his mother she was a problem. I finished eating quietly. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate the way I always do. When I stood up, the chair scraped softly against the floor. A few people glanced up. I smiled, polite and small, and said, I needed some air. Outside, the evening was cool. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in, breathing out. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel like crying. I felt clear. For the first time that night, I understood something plainly. I hadn't embarrassed anyone. I had simply outlived my usefulness at that table. After that dinner, the house felt different. It wasn't louder or quieter. It was simply emptier in a way I hadn't noticed before. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and turned on the kitchen light out of habit. The soft hum filled the room, but nothing else did. No voices. No footsteps. No one asking if I'd made it home safely. My husband's coat was still hanging by the door. I hadn't moved it since the funeral. I told myself it was because I wasn't ready. The truth was simpler. Taking it down would mean admitting he wasn't coming back to fill this space again. I set my purse on the counter and stood there for a moment, still wearing my shoes. My feet ached, but I didn't sit down right away. I looked around the kitchen as if I were seeing it for the first time. The table for four. The chair he always pulled out for me. The small crack in the tile near the sink that we never bothered to fix. After my husband passed, the house had become very quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. Friends checked in at first. Meals arrived in disposable containers. Sympathy cards lined the mantel. Then, slowly, life went on. For everyone else. For me, the days blended together. Morning light through the same window. The same cup of coffee poured to the same level. I stopped setting 2 mugs without even thinking about it. I learned to reach the top shelves myself. I learned which noises at night were just the house settling. My son used to call every Sunday. Short conversations. Polite questions. He always sounded busy. I told him I was fine, because that was easier than explaining the truth. I didn't want to be another obligation added to his calendar. Things shifted after the funeral, though I couldn't point to a single moment when it happened. He started speaking faster when we talked. He listened less. When I paused, he filled the silence instead of waiting. My daughter-in-law handled most of the arrangements. She was efficient, organized. Everyone praised her for stepping up. I thanked her, because that was what I was supposed to do. But I noticed the way decisions were made without me. Times changed. Plans adjusted. I was informed, not asked. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that they were trying to protect me, that they assumed I was tired. At night, I sat in the living room with only one lamp on. The rest of the house stayed dark. I watched old television shows more for the sound than the story. Silence had a way of pressing in on my thoughts. I replayed that moment at the dinner table more than once. Not his words. The room. The stillness. The way no one intervened. I realized I had been grieving more than my husband. I had been grieving my place. That night, I rinsed my cup and set it in the drying rack. I checked the doors, the way I always do. When I went upstairs, I paused outside the bedroom and looked in. The bed was made neatly, one side untouched. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt something steadier than that. I understood then that losing my husband had changed my life. But losing my voice in my own family had changed how others saw me. And once that happens, it doesn't quietly fix itself. The changes didn't happen all at once. They came quietly, folded into ordinary moments, the kind you don't question until they start to pile up. A few days after that dinner, my son stopped by unannounced. He didn't stay long. He stood in the doorway of the living room instead of sitting down, his keys still in his hand. He asked how I was doing, but his eyes moved around the room while I answered, as if he were taking inventory. "You should really think about simplifying things," he said casually, nodding toward the shelves and furniture. "This place is a lot for one person." I told him I was managing just fine. He smiled, thin and quick, and said he knew. Of course he knew. Then he changed the subject. Later that week, I noticed a box missing from the hallway closet. It wasn't anything important. Old photo albums. Paperwork I hadn't sorted through yet. I assumed I'd moved it myself and forgotten. Grief does that to you, people say. Then my daughter-in-law called and mentioned they were reorganizing some family records. She spoke as if it were already settled. I didn't remember agreeing to that, but I didn't argue. I thanked her for handling it. At the grocery store, I ran into a neighbor who asked if everything was all right. She said she'd heard I might be moving. I laughed softly and told her there must have been some confusion. When I got home, I stood in the kitchen for a long time holding the grocery bags by my feet, trying to remember who could have said that. Phone calls started to feel different, shorter, more purposeful. My son asked specific questions now. About bills. About the house. About what I planned to do long term. When I answered, there was always a pause afterward, as if he were weighing my words against a plan I wasn't part of. I noticed small things too. A cabinet reorganized. A drawer that no longer held what I remembered placing there. My spare key wasn't where I usually kept it. I searched the house twice before admitting to myself that it was gone. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law said she'd taken it temporarily, just in case. She said it made sense. I nodded, because disagreeing felt unnecessary. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. They were in the kitchen, speaking quietly. My name came up, followed by words like practical and for her own good. I stepped back before they noticed me. That was when I understood something important. They weren't reacting to a problem. They were preparing for one they had already decided existed. I sat at the dining table that evening, alone, and thought about how often I'd excused behavior like this. How many times I'd told myself my son was just stressed, that his wife meant well, that families go through phases, but this felt organized, thought through. I wasn't being pushed. I was being eased out. The realization didn't make my heart race. It didn't bring tears. It settled in slowly, like a weight finding its place. I looked around the room and saw it clearly then. This wasn't about concern. It was about control. About deciding my role without asking if I was ready to give it up. I washed my plate and dried it carefully, placing it back in the cabinet where it had always been. That night, I made a quiet decision. Not to confront anyone, not to explain myself, just to start paying closer attention. Because once people begin rearranging your life without your permission, the most dangerous thing you can do is keep assuming it's an accident. That night, I pulled out the old photo box from the bottom of the closet. It was heavier than I remembered. Not because of the pictures, but because of what they represented. Years. Decades. Proof that my life had been full long before anyone decided it was inconvenient. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the lid slowly. The first photo was creased at the corner. My husband and me on our front porch, years ago, both of us squinting into the sun. He had his arm around my shoulders, not for show, but because that was where his hand always rested. He used to say, "As long as I'm here, you'll never have to explain yourself to anyone." I believed him. We built this life carefully, not quickly, not carelessly. We saved, we planned, we stayed in when others went out. We fixed things ourselves when we could. When we couldn't, we waited until we could afford it. Every decision was made together. At the same kitchen table, I now sat alone at most nights. I remembered how protective he was after our son was born, how he insisted I rest, how he told people without hesitation that I was the center of the family, not the background. When our son grew older, my husband made a point of including me in everything. "Ask your mother," he'd say. "She knows." When he got sick, things changed, but not in the way people expect. He became quieter, more deliberate. He started organizing paperwork on weekends, labeling folders, writing notes in the margins. Once I asked him what he was doing. He smiled and said, "Making sure you're taken care of." I didn't push. I trusted him. After he passed, everyone told me how strong I was, how well I was handling things. What they didn't see were the small promises he'd made over the years. The way he'd always stepped in when conversations shifted away from me. The way he never allowed anyone to make decisions about our home without both of us present. Now without him, those boundaries seemed to disappear overnight. I flipped through more photos. Holidays, birthdays, our son at different ages. I noticed how often my husband stood slightly behind me in group pictures, his hand resting on my back. It wasn't accidental. It was intentional. A quiet statement. I understood something then that I hadn't wanted to name before. His absence wasn't just emotional, it was structural. He had been the line people didn't cross. Without him, I had become negotiable. The house creaked as it settled, the familiar sounds no longer comforting, just factual. I closed the photo box and placed it back where I'd found it, not because I was done remembering, but because I had remembered enough. I lay down on my side of the bed, facing the empty space beside me. I didn't speak out loud. I didn't ask for guidance. I already knew what he would have said. "Pay attention," he would have told me. "And don't give anything away just because they expect you to." As I turned off the light, I felt something steady replace the uncertainty. Grief had softened me. Loss had quieted me, but it hadn't erased me. And for the first time since his passing, I understood clearly the life we built together was not something others could reorganize simply because he was gone. A few days later, someone finally said something out loud. It wasn't my son. And it wasn't my daughter-in-law. It was my sister-in-law, my husband's younger sister, who had always been quiet during family gatherings. She called me in the afternoon, her voice hesitant, asking if she could stop by. She said she had something she'd been meaning to talk to me about for a while. When she arrived, she didn't sit right away. She stood in the living room, twisting her purse strap around her fingers, looking anywhere but at me. I made tea and waited. Silence has a way of encouraging people to speak. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like I'm interfering," she finally said. I told her she could say whatever she needed to. My voice surprised me. It was calm, steadier than I felt weeks earlier. She sat down then, leaning forward. "They've been talking," she said quietly. "Not just recently, for a while now." I didn't ask who they were. I already knew. She told me she'd overheard conversations at family events, that my name came up often, but never when I was around. That words like options and next steps were used casually as if they were discussing a renovation, not a person. "They keep saying it's for your comfort," she said, "that it would be easier for you, that you wouldn't have to worry so much." I nodded once. I had heard those phrases before. She hesitated, then continued. "They've also mentioned the house. more than once. I looked down at my hands, resting in my lap. They were still. I noticed that before anything else. She explained that my daughter-in-law had asked questions about property taxes, about maintenance costs, about whether I'd considered downsizing. Questions that didn't sound curious. They sounded preparatory. I didn't like how it felt, she said, so I wanted you to know. I thanked her, not because it made me feel better, but because it was information I needed. After she left, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't reach for my phone. I let the quiet settle. Everything made more sense now. The comments, the missing box, the taken spare key, the way decisions had been forming without me. This wasn't concern unfolding naturally. It was a plan taking shape. That evening, my son called. He asked how my day had been. His tone was light, practiced. I told him it had been quiet. He said that was good. Quiet was good for me, he said. He mentioned casually that there were some senior communities nearby he'd read about. Just something to think about, he added quickly. No pressure. I told him I'd keep it in mind. My voice didn't change. When the call ended, I stood up and walked through the house, room by room. I touched the back of a chair, the edge of the counter, the banister on the stairs. These weren't just objects. They were markers. Proof of presence. I realized then that what unsettled me most wasn't the idea of change. It was the assumption that I wouldn't resist it. They believed I was tired, that grief had made me passive, that silence meant agreement. They were wrong. I didn't need to announce anything. I didn't need to confront anyone. I simply needed to stop being unaware. And from that moment on, I was no longer just living in my house. I was paying attention. The next interaction came sooner than I expected. It happened during a phone call, the kind that sounds casual on the surface but carries weight underneath. My son called in the early evening, right around the time I usually started preparing dinner. I let it ring once before answering, not out of strategy, but because I was drying my hands. He asked how I was feeling, not how I was doing. Feeling. I noticed that difference. I said I was fine. He paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch. Then he said he and his wife had been talking about me. The way people say that when they've already reached a conclusion. We just want to make sure you're okay, he said. Lately, you've seemed a little sensitive. The word landed softly but stayed. He went on, explaining that at the dinner, I'd made things uncomfortable, that some relatives had mentioned it afterward, that my tone, my timing, my comments, though he didn't specify which, had created an awkward moment. You didn't do anything wrong exactly, he said quickly. But sometimes it's better to be more aware of how things come across. I held the phone against my ear and stared out the kitchen window. The yard looked the same as it always had. The tree my husband planted years ago still leaned slightly to the left. Nothing outside had changed. I don't want people to feel uncomfortable around you, he added. Especially family. I understood then what he was really saying. My presence was being reframed as a liability, something to manage. I told him I understood. My voice sounded even. He seemed relieved by that. He suggested gently that maybe I should take a step back from larger gatherings for a while, that smaller settings might be easier for everyone. He said it like a compromise, like he was offering me dignity. I agreed. Again. After the call ended, I set my phone down and finished preparing dinner. One plate. One glass. I ate standing at the counter, not because I was upset, but because I didn't feel like sitting. Later that week, there was another gathering. I wasn't invited. No one said it directly. I just found out afterward through a photo posted online. Smiling faces, familiar table, the same dishes I used to bring. I didn't comment. I didn't ask why. A few days after that, my daughter-in-law stopped by briefly. She didn't come in. She stood on the porch and spoke quickly, explaining they were just trying to reduce stress. For everyone. She said I should focus on myself now. Rest. Simplicity. She smiled the entire time. When she left, I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it for a moment. Not because I felt overwhelmed, but because something had finally become undeniable. This wasn't about helping me. It was about reshaping me into someone quieter. Smaller. Easier to place on the sidelines without resistance. The message was consistent now. Spoken gently. Repeated often. Don't be too visible. Don't take up space. Don't make others uncomfortable. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. I thought about how carefully this had been done. No raised voices, no harsh ultimatums, just steady pressure, applied with polite concern. That night, I opened a notebook and wrote down a few dates. Conversations, phrases I remembered clearly. I didn't write how they made me feel, just what was said. Who said it? It wasn't anger that moved my pen, it was clarity. They believed I would continue agreeing, that my silence meant acceptance. What they didn't understand was this. I wasn't staying quiet because I was weak. I was staying quiet because I was listening. And once you start hearing the pattern clearly, you stop mistaking it for kindness. I left the house early that morning. Not because I had somewhere important to go, but because staying inside had begun to feel like waiting for permission I no longer intended to ask for. I locked the door carefully behind me, the same way I always did, and paused for a second with my hand still on the knob. The house stood quiet, solid, unchanged. I drove without turning on the radio. The streets were familiar. The traffic light. I noticed how steady everything felt once I was moving. No one directing me. No one adjusting my pace. When I returned later that afternoon, there was a message on my phone from my son. Short, polite. He said they'd stopped by and hadn't seen my car. He hoped everything was all right. I didn't respond right away. That evening, I made dinner and ate slowly at the table. I cleared my plate, washed it, and set it to dry. I moved through the house with intention, noticing details I'd overlooked before. The way the hallway light flickered slightly before settling. The faint scratch on the banister from years ago. Familiar things, grounding things. A few days later, there was another family gathering. I found out the same way as before. A photo online. Everyone smiling. My son standing close to his wife. The table full. The caption cheerful. I looked at the image longer than I needed to. Not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something. I had been removed from the picture without being told. No explanation. No conversation. Just absence. That realization was quieter than I expected. There was no rush of emotion. Just a sense of finality. I wasn't drifting out of their lives. I was being edged out deliberately, gently enough that no one had to feel guilty about it. Later that week, my sister-in-law called again. She sounded uncomfortable. She said she hoped I wasn't upset about missing the gathering. She said everyone assumed I preferred quiet these days. I told her I was fine. That was true. After the call, I went into the bedroom and opened the closet. I pulled out a small suitcase I hadn't used in years. I set it on the bed and stared at it for a moment. Not because I planned to pack, but because I wanted to remind myself of something. I had lived a full life before being included in anyone else's plans. I closed the suitcase and slid it back into place. That night, I slept well. In the days that followed, I noticed how rarely my phone rang, how messages became more infrequent, how updates about family plans stopped arriving altogether. It was as if the decision had already been made, and everyone was adjusting to it naturally. I didn't protest. I didn't ask questions. I didn't attempt to reinsert myself. Instead, I began doing small things on my own terms. I rearranged a drawer. I organized paperwork that had been left untouched. I sat in the living room without turning on the television, letting the quiet exist without filling it. I understood now that silence could mean different things. For them, my silence meant compliance. For me, it meant withdrawal. Deliberate. Controlled. The difference mattered. One afternoon, as I stood at the window watching the light shift across the yard, I felt a strange sense of relief. Being excluded had clarified something I hadn't wanted to see before. I had been invited only as long as I was convenient, as long as I stayed within the version of myself they preferred. Now that I was no longer useful in that way, the invitations had stopped. And once I accepted that truth, something else followed. I stopped waiting to be included. Because the moment you realize you've been quietly pushed aside is also the moment you understand you're no longer obligated to stand where they left you. By then, I had stopped feeling surprised. What settled in instead was something quieter and more permanent. Understanding. I began to see the pattern clearly, not as isolated moments, but as a sequence that had been unfolding for some time. The dinner, the phone calls, the missing invitations, the gentle language wrapped around firm decisions. None of it stood alone. Together, it formed a shape. I noticed how often the word help was used when no help had been requested. How comfort became a reason to limit my presence. How concern was expressed only after plans were already in motion. I replayed conversations in my mind, not emotionally, but carefully, listening for what had been said, and more importantly, what had been assumed. The assumption that I would adapt, that I would shrink, that I would eventually agree without needing to be convinced. It wasn't malice. It was entitlement. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law stopped by again. This time, she came inside. She sat on the edge of the couch instead of settling in. She spoke in that familiar tone, soft, measured, almost rehearsed. She said she hoped I wasn't feeling isolated, that they worried I might misinterpret their intentions, that everything they were doing was meant to make things easier for everyone involved. Everyone. She mentioned age. Not directly, just enough to imply it. She mentioned how quickly time moves, how important it is to plan ahead. She smiled when she spoke, watching my face closely, as if waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. When she left, the house returned to its usual stillness. I didn't feel offended. I felt informed. I understood then that they weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to manage me, to reposition me into something quieter, less visible, easier to work around. That realization didn't make me angry. It clarified my role in their minds. I was no longer a participant. I was a variable. That evening, I stood in the hallway and looked at the family photos lining the wall. I saw myself in the background of many of them, smiling, present, supportive, always available, but rarely centered. I wondered when that shift had happened, when being dependable had turned into being disposable. I sat down and opened my notebook again. I didn't write about feelings. I wrote facts. Who said what? When decisions were mentioned, when assumptions were made on my behalf. There was comfort in accuracy. I realized something else too. My silence had allowed them to believe they were in control of the narrative, that they could define my limits without resistance. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means observation. I wasn't lost. I wasn't confused. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was awake. The difference mattered. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, I felt a sense of alignment settle in. Not with them, but with myself. With the life I had lived. With the standards I had always held quietly. I didn't need to reclaim anything loudly. I simply needed to stop allowing myself to be redefined. They thought I was fading into the background. What they didn't see was that I had stepped back intentionally. And when someone steps back with clarity, it isn't retreat. It's preparation. By then, I had stopped feeling surprised. What settled in instead was something quieter and more permanent. Understanding. I began to see the pattern clearly, not as isolated moments, but as a sequence that had been unfolding for some time. The dinner, the phone calls, the missing invitations, the gentle language wrapped around firm decisions. None of it stood alone. Together it formed a shape. I noticed how often the word help was used when no help had been requested. How comfort became a reason to limit my presence. How concern was expressed only after plans were already in motion. I replayed conversations in my mind, not emotionally, but carefully, listening for what had been said, and more importantly, what had been assumed. The assumption that I would adapt, that I would shrink, that I would eventually agree without needing to be convinced. It wasn't malice. It was entitlement. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law stopped by again. This time, she came inside. She sat on the edge of the couch instead of settling in. She spoke in that familiar tone, soft, measured, almost rehearsed. She said she hoped I wasn't feeling isolated, that they worried I might misinterpret their intentions, that everything they were doing was meant to make things easier for everyone involved. Everyone. She mentioned age, not directly, just enough to imply it. She mentioned how quickly time moves, how important it is to plan ahead. She smiled when she spoke, watching my face closely, as if waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. When she left, the house returned to its usual stillness. I didn't feel offended. I felt informed. I understood then that they weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to manage me, to reposition me into something quieter, less visible, easier to work around. That realization didn't make me angry. It clarified my role in their minds. I was no longer a participant. I was a variable. That evening, I stood in the hallway and looked at the family photos lining the wall. I saw myself in the background of many of them, smiling, present, supportive, always available, but rarely centered. I wondered when that shift had happened, when being dependable had turned into being disposable. I sat down and opened my notebook again. I didn't write about feelings. I wrote facts, who said what, when decisions were mentioned, when assumptions were made on my behalf. There was comfort in accuracy. I realized something else too. My silence had allowed them to believe they were in control of the narrative, that they could define my limits without resistance. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means observation. I wasn't lost. I wasn't confused. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was awake. The difference mattered. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, I felt a sense of alignment settle in. Not with them, but with myself, with the life I had lived, with the standards I had always held quietly. I didn't need to reclaim anything loudly. I simply needed to stop allowing myself to be redefined. They thought I was fading into the background. What they didn't see was that I had stepped back intentionally, and when someone steps back with clarity, it isn't retreat. It's preparation. By the time I began to act, nothing about it felt sudden. There was no dramatic moment, no confrontation, no announcement, just a series of quiet decisions made on ordinary days. I started with paperwork. I pulled folders from drawers I hadn't opened in years. Statements, deeds, policies, documents my husband had organized so carefully toward the end. I read them slowly, not skimming, not rushing. I wanted to understand exactly what existed, and just as importantly, what did not. Each page brought a sense of steadiness, not relief, certainty. I made notes in the same notebook I'd been using. Dates, account names, numbers. I didn't share this process with anyone. There was no need. This was not preparation for a conversation. It was preparation for clarity. When my son called later that week, his tone was lighter than usual, almost friendly. He asked how I'd been spending my time. I told him I'd been organizing things around the house. He said that was good, productive. He asked if I'd given more thought to options. He didn't define the word. He didn't need to. I said I was considering everything carefully. That answer satisfied him. For now. I noticed how quickly people relax when they believe you're moving in the direction they expect. Over the next few days, I made appointments, routine ones, nothing that would raise questions. I went alone. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I was precise. I didn't argue assumptions. I corrected facts. At home, I continued my usual routine. Morning coffee, short walks, quiet evenings. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was intentional. I let them believe their plan was unfolding naturally. My daughter-in-law sent a message suggesting we have lunch soon. Just the two of us. She added a smiling emoji. I replied politely and said we could plan something later. I noticed how easily delays were accepted, how little urgency there was when they thought time was on their side. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room. This was where decisions had been made for decades, where my husband and I had talked through problems without raising our voices, where we had planned carefully, knowing that patience often mattered more than speed. I wasn't doing anything different now. I was simply applying the same principles alone. I understood that what unsettles people most isn't resistance, it's unpredictability. Silence, paired with competence. Calm, paired with preparation. I had no intention of surprising anyone theatrically. I intended to be correct. As the days passed, I felt no urge to explain myself. The need to justify had left me. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing not to broadcast. There's a difference. One afternoon, as I filed away a final document, I felt something settle that hadn't been there before. Not triumph. Not vindication. Alignment. My actions matched my understanding. My pace matched my purpose. They believed I was still catching up emotionally, still adjusting, still processing. In reality, I had already moved beyond reaction. I was positioning myself quietly, deliberately, exactly where I needed to be. And once that kind of preparation is complete, the outcome no longer feels uncertain. It feels inevitable. The shift became visible without anyone announcing it. It started with confusion. My son called one afternoon, his voice tighter than usual. He said he'd received an email he didn't expect. He didn't say what it was at first. He asked if I knew anything about it. I told him I did. There was a pause, longer than the ones he usually allowed. He said he thought there must have been a misunderstanding. that certain things weren't supposed to be handled yet, that the timing felt abrupt. He spoke carefully, choosing words the way people do when they're trying to regain footing. I listened. He asked if we could meet in person. He said it might be easier to talk face to face. I agreed and suggested a day later that week. When we met, he arrived early. I noticed that immediately. He didn't bring his wife this time. He sat across from me at the table, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. He looked concerned, but not angry. He said he was surprised, that he hadn't realized I'd been thinking so far ahead, that he'd assumed there would be more discussion before anything was finalized. I reminded him calmly that there had been discussion, just not with him present. He frowned, as if that hadn't occurred to him as a possibility. He asked if I felt pushed, if I felt misunderstood. The questions came quickly now, stacked one after another, searching for a way back into familiar territory. I answered simply. I said I had noticed changes. I said I had paid attention. That unsettled him more than emotion ever would have. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law called. Her voice was softer than usual. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said they'd only ever wanted what was best. She said things sometimes move faster than expected. I told her everything was moving exactly as it should. She didn't respond right away. In the days that followed, the tone shifted. Messages became more frequent. Invitations reappeared. Suggestions were phrased more gently now, with room left for my response. I noticed the difference. It wasn't concern. It was recalibration. They had realized something important. Decisions could be made without them. At the next family gathering, I was treated differently. Seats were offered. Questions were asked before plans were mentioned. My son watched me more closely than before, as if trying to read what he'd missed. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't assert anything. I simply remained consistent. That consistency seemed to unsettle them more than resistance ever could. At one point, my son pulled me aside and asked if everything was all right between us. His voice was quiet, almost careful. I told him it was. He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. What he couldn't understand was that I wasn't trying to send a message. I wasn't making a point. I was simply no longer available to be managed. The dynamic had shifted, and they could feel it. The assumptions they'd relied on no longer held. My silence no longer meant compliance. My calm no longer meant passivity. They had expected gratitude, adjustment, acceptance. What they encountered instead was certainty. And certainty changes the balance in any room it enters. By the end of that week, it was clear to everyone that things were different. Not broken, just different. They spoke more carefully now. They listened more closely. Not because I demanded it, but because they understood, finally, that I was not where they had left me. I was standing exactly where I chose to be. The last time my son repeated those words, they no longer carried weight. You're embarrassing us. He didn't say it out loud this time. He didn't need to. It lived in the way he hesitated before speaking, in the way his wife chose her words carefully, in the way the room shifted when I entered, then settled again when I took my seat. What had changed wasn't them. It was me. I no longer tried to anticipate discomfort. I no longer softened my presence. I no longer adjusted myself to make others feel at ease. I spoke when I had something to say. I stayed quiet when I didn't. Neither required explanation. At a family gathering weeks later, I arrived on time. I brought nothing but myself. No extra dishes, no apologies, no offerings meant to earn my place. I sat at the table, straight-backed, unhurried. Conversation moved around me instead of over me. When someone asked my opinion, I gave it plainly. When no one did, I ate in peace. No one told me I was embarrassing them. No one needed to. Because the embarrassment had never been about my behavior. It had been about their loss of control. After everyone left that night, I stayed behind to help clean up, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I rinsed a plate, dried it, set it aside. The simple rhythm felt grounding, familiar, mine. As I walked out to my car, my son followed me. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, uncertain. He asked if I was upset with him. The question sounded younger than he did. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with disappointment, with clarity. I'm not upset, I said, and I meant it. He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand something that couldn't be explained quickly. I drove home with the windows down, the evening air cool against my skin. The house greeted me the same way it always had, Solid, quiet, honest. I turned on one lamp. I sat down. I didn't feel lonely. I felt complete. That night I thought about everything that had happened since that dinner. Since the moment my son decided my presence reflected poorly on him. Since silence had been mistaken for weakness. Since concern had been used as a cover for control. I had lost my husband. I had lost my place. And then slowly I had found myself again. Not by fighting. Not by pleading. But by standing still long enough for the truth to reveal itself. I was never embarrassing. I was inconvenient. Inconvenient to plans made without me. Inconvenient to narratives that required me to shrink. Inconvenient to people who mistook my kindness for compliance. And once I understood that, everything changed. I turned off the light and went upstairs. The house settled around me, familiar sounds in familiar places. I didn't need reassurance. I didn't need permission. I had my name back, my voice back, my place back. And if anyone felt uncomfortable with that, they could learn to live with it. Because I finally was.